Hi guys, Hayden Goes in here. It's been a while since I did my last video, but I've been at college and it's been taking up a bunch of my time. But I'm back. I got my break in between my 2 semesters. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is, using crankbaits, and that's going to be a lot of the first things that we're going to be throwing come springtime. There's 3 main baits that I like to use. First thing is going to be search baits, and that's going to be your crankbaits. It's going to be your jerk baits, spinner baits, that kind of thing. Moving baits that's going to trigger some kind of reaction strike. When that bait is moving, bounces off a cover, changes direction, starts, stops, something like that. Something that's going to trigger a reaction bite. And then the second main thing that I like to use is topwater baits. Whether that's a frog, a popper, a spook, something like that. Love throwing those kind of baits. And then lastly is something that's on the bottom. A Chippewa lures jig, a worm, a big brush hog, something like that. Those are the 3 main style of baits. But really what I'm going to be talking about today is fishing a crankbait. Specifically Ketchum Custom Lures. They make a bunch of awesome crankbaits. That's what I like to use for my crankbaits. And first and foremost, when you're using a crankbait, the biggest thing is water displacement, okay? So bass, when they're out there, they're swimming around in the water, they can feel the vibrations that your lure is giving off, the water displacement that it makes. That's the biggest thing that I look for in a crankbait. When you're in really cold water scenarios, you're going to want a tight wobble. If you're in warmer water scenarios, as that temperature is rising throughout the spring, the summer, the fall, I like to use something that displaces a lot of water, creates a lot of vibrations in the water, and it allows those bass to find your bait, to feel that bait with your ladder line, most importantly. So that's a really important thing. Another really important thing about crankbait is the depth that it's going to run at. Where I'm from here up in the north, I live on a lot of river systems, and that's where I'm from, and the water's really, really dirty. And that goes for the springtime pretty much throughout the country. Wherever you go, the water's generally going to be dirtier because you have a lot of runoff coming in, to the lakes from streams, from rivers, whatever it may be. And what's really, really important to locate bass, with a crankbait, shallow covered, medium depth, deep diver, whatever you happen to be using, is that when the water gets dirty, it pulls the fish shallow. Okay, it pulls the fish shallow. If you can imagine a bass is in 20 foot of water and it's really, really dirty, that light penetration is not going to be able to get down to 20 foot. So it brings those bass shallow. So next time you're fishing in some some dirty water, pick up maybe a square bill or something like that. Go shallow because that's where those bass are going to be. Next is it's going to push those fish right to the wood, right to the cover, next to a rock, something like that. And what's really, really cool about these baits is they displace a lot of water, and especially in the springtime, if you can hear that, they got a nice loud rattle in them. So it really brings the bass, to the bait. It lets them find the bait because not only is it displacing water and they can hear it, but they can hear it with the rattles and with it displacing water. The fish can feel it in their lateral line. So that's a couple really important factors. And then, the last kind of main thing is when you're fishing a crankbait, I love to fish them when it's cloudy, when it's, raining, when there's a ripple on the water, something like that. It's pushing the bait fish around, it's stirring up the water, and it allows those bass, when you have a lure coming around, they just naturally, they want to go and they want to eat it. So those are a couple main things. In the springtime, I love throwing a crankbait. Pre-spawn specifically, I can cover a lot of water. I can find those active fish. But after I've found those active fish, you're never going to catch every single fish with a crankbait. So you have to make sure once you've found a couple and you've located some bass, slow down, pick up a jig, pick up a drop shot, a wacky rig, something like that to slow down to make sure you're catching all those fish in that area. So I like throwing a lot of crankbaits, that imitate bluegill. That's mostly the main forage up here, but Ketchum Custom Lures, they make a bunch of different baits, shad style baits, anything to fit essentially the bait fish that the bass are going to be eating. After the spawn's done, one of the main things people find can be tricky is locating bass in that tricky post-spawn area. Well, if you're in the back of a creek, that's where those fish are spawning. And they're going to be transitioning out to that deeper water, to that main body of water, to that drop-off, something like that out in the main lake. And you want to try to ambush those bass in between. And a really good way to ambush those bass is to be fishing secondary points. Secondary points are a great tool to fish when the bass are moving out to the deep water. You know, I like using the mid-depth range crankbaits then when they're in that post-spawn area. And then lastly, I'm not going to go too in-depth with it, but you know, using fluorocarbon line, I like to use P-line. It's super important. It's invisible to those fish. They can't see it. Abrasion resistant, so you can fish it around wood and cover, anything like that. When I'm throwing a square bill crankbait, like these right here, I love throwing them on 15 pound. It may be a little bit heavier than some guys like to use, but I like using 15 pounds specifically because I get a lot more feel out of that bait. So the rod and the reel is really important, and we can get into that in another video session later. But I like using 15 because it gives me a lot more feel to that bait. If I'm using some mid-depth crankbaits in that post-spawn phase, I like going down to 10 or 12 pound tests. It really gets that bait down to that desired depth that you want to be running at. Generally speaking, when you're picking a crankbait out, you want to pick out a bait that goes about 1 to 2 foot deeper than what the depth that you're fishing at. So if I'm fishing in, let's just say 6 foot of water, I want to pick a crankbait that's going to run around 8 foot deep or so, because then it's stirring up the bottom, it's deflecting off cover, and when it deflects off cover, when your bait moves, changes directions, start, stop, that kind of thing, that's what's going to trigger those reaction bites. So next time you're going out, especially in the springtime and then your post-spawn, pick up a crankbait. It's a great bait. It can find a lot of fish for you, and then once you do find them, you know, just remember, slow down. So go check out Ketchum Custom Lures. And then lastly, P-line. That's what I like to use. Check them both out. P-line just came out with a new tactical fluorocarbon as well. I just ordered a bunch actually, and it should be probably arriving at my doorstep here in the next couple days. So I'm super excited to spool that up with all my new reels and stuff that I got for this upcoming year. So check them out. You guys won't be disappointed.